Okay, thank you very much, everyone, for being here, and thank you to John and Paul. I think they set up this conversation very well, moving us from the precious metals into getting John's thoughts on critical minerals. Very important issue of the day. My name is Anthony Vaccaro. I'm the president of the Northern Miner Group. The Northern Miner Group is made up of the Northern Miner, which has been the place of record for the mining industry for over 100 years, as well as mining.com, which is now one of the biggest online sites for mining, independent mining news, and the Canadian Mining Journal. So it's a pleasure to be here, and it really is a pleasure to have such esteemed panelists join me today. We're joined by Madeleine Bugal, who is Deputy Assistant Secretary for National Battery Strategy at the Department of Energy, or the DOE, which has come up a lot already here this morning. It is very important to our sector. And I'm joined by Abigail Hunter, who is Executive Director at SAFE, which is the Center for Critical Mineral Strategy. And lest anyone thinks SAFE has anything to do with PPE think tank, it is not. SAFE stands for Securing America's Future Energy, and Abigail is a much sought after speaker on many of these critical issues today. So thank you both for taking the time to join us here. I think I was very excited about speaking with both Madeleine and Abigail here today is that we are at a point where these massive macro themes and issues have greater implications for the metals and mining sectors, perhaps more than any time in any of our collective lives. I've been in the industry for over 20 years now, so this really is a critical juncture for our sector. And what I wanted to try to do here with our conversations, let's start. Abigail and Madeleine are both experts on that macro, and they can really give us a sense of what is going on. But then we do want to try to bring that down to you, the investors, and try to tease out some themes of what the implications are potentially for investors. Okay? So let's jump in, shall we? Abigail, I'm going to start with you. Of course, so much of the frame for these conversations is about where China has managed to get to in the last 20 years and where the West has maybe allowed a bit of a gap to open up. So I thought it'd be good to start with you on that big issue. There is this, this de-risking from China when we are so reliant on so many of these critical minerals being especially processed in China. So why don't we come to you and get a sense, taking the temperature, where are we in this process, we being the West? Are we becoming a bit more competitive today, or is there still the structural imbalance that really isn't being chipped away at?
So as you all probably appreciate, we're dealing with a web of roadblocks that often coincide with one another when it comes to diversifying our supply chains and standing up alternative supply that is cost competitive in the West. I like to think of what's motivating policymakers in two buckets to that end. So what's really enabling China's structural advantage, and then what still remains in terms of the cost disadvantages that the West have in terms of standing up new supply. So the structural advantages, I'm sure you guys are familiar, but a high degree of indirect and direct subsidies going into these projects, not only in mainland China, but internationally, supporting mine finance through really low cost or sometimes like zero cost supports from the government, the surrounding industrial ecosystems that are enabling companies to play off of each other through, selling each other reagents, different component parts, the equipment ecosystem that has emerged, and then this really, really strong demand from the downstream that exists within China. All of that creates this incredible structural advantage that is hard for us to unwind. It took decades, as Anthony alluded to. Well, it took decades for us to deindustrialize, so it's creating a lot of challenges. And then if we were to cut ourselves off from Chinese cheap and lower standard supply today, we wouldn't necessarily have alternatives that are cost competitive at scale, at spec, readily available. And so that's really where we need to kind of focus on making sure that nascent industry or existing capacity is able to compete through government support in different forms, many of which I'm sure we'll hear from Deputy Assistant Secretary Bugal on momentarily, but really being able to kind of support directly on projects, but then work together with allies to make sure that all of those projects are insulated when they come online from any type of price gouging or just strategic disadvantage, nefarious or not, right? When you have one competitor in the market that has incredible influence over all nodes of the supply chain, which exists for certain critical minerals, you're obviously just gonna be at a disadvantage when you're getting things going.
Great. Thank you, Abigail, for that. And Madeleine, over to you. I mean, the DOE has done a really, I would say, pretty incredible job. I'm coming from Canada, and I think the impact the DOE has had on the sector has been stronger here for sure. We're hearing it in conversations all the time. So, there's this mandate here to optimize the supply chain. From where you're sitting, what are you looking at to measure how that big process, historical process, I would say, how it's going? What do you look at?
Absolutely. And thank you, Anthony, so much for having me here to give the Department of Energy's perspective on this. And from where I sit in the Critical Minerals and Energy Innovation Office, which was recently realigned, it took all of the critical minerals capabilities throughout the department and aligned it under that office. So very, very excited to be here at this time where there's so much momentum in this industry, in this space, and so much support in the administration for, really de-risking our supply chains, creating a secure supply chain. And what we've been hearing is that America's mining industry has been sending a clear signal that they are ready for the U.S. to take a global lead on critical minerals and materials to accelerate domestic production, refinement, and manufacturing of critical minerals and materials. We've seen this frequently in the press, we've heard it in meetings with industry, and we're seeing it in investments companies are making in our nation's domestic supply chain. DOE is directly supporting the goals that President Trump has laid out through the many, many executive orders on critical minerals and materials. And our three biggest benchmark indicators, for how we're looking at this issue and how we're evaluating it is to diversify and expand our critical mineral supply, develop critical minerals alternatives, and improve materials manufacturing and efficiency and recovery and reuse. Just last August, the department announced a major notice of intent for funding for nearly $1 billion of funding opportunities across mining, processing, and manufacturing, touching everything from rare earth magnets to semiconductor materials and manufacturing processes to reinforce the priorities laid out by President Trump. As part of this work, DOE is spurring the development of next-generation extraction technologies, new midstream processing, refining technologies, new materials, and innovative recycling technologies. We're also supporting the build-out of domestic facilities and industrial partnerships that will reshore minerals processing and manufacturing. We're looking for an upcoming major announcement on downstream investment from CMEI's Manufacturing Deployment Office of around $134 million for the rare earth demonstration facility funding opportunity. So these projects will be aimed at demonstrating the commercial viability of recovering and refining rare earth elements from unconventional feedstocks like mine tailings, e-waste, and other waste materials. We're really working on securing domestically sourced critical mineral supply chains, and it remains a key priority for the department to the degree that we're able to close the supply chains towards any sort of malign factors.
Okay, great. You think of America didn't become this empire by accident, right? I mean, the innovative spirit of America is absolutely legendary and continues to be a competitive advantage. But you think of Silicon Valley as getting a lot of that talent. I mean, we're hearing now that, grad students from top American colleges are being encouraged to come into the metals and mining industry, that it is absolutely so important. Can you talk a little bit more, you've touched upon it there, about unlocking this innovative spirit that seems to be latent within the kind of what it is to be American? I mean, you talked about funding coming in. Is there other initiatives? Is there other things that the DOE is looking to really kind of tap into that?
Yeah, we're looking across the entire supply chain, and workforce is a very key aspect that we're looking at as well. I think the number of graduates in mining fields is just not nearly what we need it to be today. So that's a major priority for the department. We're looking at all options, partnerships, labs, universities across the table to really help engage the workforce, engage students towards the mining sector. But beyond just on the mining side, we're looking, it's not enough to just, focus on the mining side. We have to focus on the midstream and downstream technologies as well. We recently put out a $500 million notice of funding opportunity on battery materials, demonstration and development of commercial processing for critical minerals in the battery space. So that will, work on the commercial viability, the larger scale ups, de-risking the innovative technologies. We announced 5 selections in a trace gallium partnership intermediary agreement from our Advanced Manufacturing and Materials and Production Technologies Office. That was back in March of this year. So that's 5 R&D projects across the United States that were selected because of their advanced innovative technologies in gallium recovery from and domestic metals processing from unique feedstocks. These projects complement the other federal investments in the gallium supply chain they're rapidly prototyping novel technologies for gallium recovery. We're also working on the Energy Materials and Processing at Scale, or EMAPS facility at the National Lab of the Rockies. Just had a big event there just a couple of weeks ago. So really exciting to see that come to fruition. It's going to be a 127,000 square foot pilot scale facility, processing facility that is scheduled to be ready next year.
Great.
Can I just tout
Yeah,
2
please,
things the
jump in.
DOE is also doing? So Deputy Assistant Secretary Bugal doesn't need to just kind of sell you guys independently. If you go to the DOE website, they've done an incredible job in mapping out all of these different workforce opportunities and the salaries affiliated with them. It really is something to behold, because it inspires a lot of people to think about a profession that maybe they weren't necessarily aware of in this sector and what it could mean for their families and livelihoods. And the second thing, just from an investor perspective, the department also put out a request for information in the last few days around catalyzing investment, particularly in that kind of VC space, leveraging the innovation of Silicon Valley and pairing those efforts with all of the innovative focus that the Department of Energy funding opportunities have presented. So again, just helping kind of read your book for you, but it is great to see some of this stuff, the attention that we're getting on this issue, both from the workforce side, but then also activating interesting pools of capital.
Yeah, it is very exciting. And I'll triple down on that. I have an anecdote as well. Well-known mining executive from a blue chip company who I won't name, but one of the top mining companies in the world, told me, Toronto-based, was down in DC, ended up at a small meeting, and Howard Lutnick was there, and said that we don't want our top graduates to necessarily go to Silicon Valley. We're actively telling them to get into mining and metals. So that he came back just like, wow, they're really serious in DC about that. So just to give some extra weight to what is going on here. Abigail, off the top, you talked about some of those structural advantages that China does have when we're talking about critical minerals, especially processing. Maybe if you could give us a little more detail of what those structural advantages look like, with an eye towards, again, how we're going to close the gap. Is it about replicating some of the, what can be replicated, what can't? Just a little more detail would be much appreciated.
So in partnership with the US government, my team's been focusing on graphite supply chain specifically. So I'll answer this question like with one supply chain in mind, but I think that there's an incredible amount of overlap of structural advantages that exist in other mineral supply chains. But what we found was the structural advantages are state-backed, low-cost financing, companies prioritizing market share over essentially project economics, low subsidized energy costs affiliated with these projects coming online, lax environmental regulations, industrial clusters, and then large downstream demand. So I'm not necessarily someone who's purporting that we should be taking China's book, copy and pasting it, and doing what we can. I think that the administration has done a pretty good job of seeing where these advantages exist and then being able to kind of use our tools within a capitalistic system to be able to send a signal and then intervene when the non-market actors are adversely affecting any project economics from coming online. I would say one area to not compromise on is the environmental standards. Certainly, we talk a lot in Washington about reforming our permitting processes, but ultimately, this does not mean that we should come against what it means to require basic environmental requirements for specific projects. Streamlining is important, but the reason we have some challenges in getting domestic mine processing, smelting, production online is because we have a colored history, and people do not necessarily want to have massive environmental degradation, air emission challenges for their families in their area. And so we have to adhere to those standards as a competitive advantage, especially as we shine a spotlight on existing supply chains and move away from the hear no evil, see no evil way that we're currently operating, where we get our little end devices. We don't necessarily appreciate the standards that the materials were extracted, exploited, processed through. One area where we could maybe look a little bit creatively is the low-cost finance. You're seeing what is really an incredible show of interagency coordination on leveraging all of the different funding buckets. I was listening to the last panel. You can already see there's between the DOE that's on Deputy Assistant Bugal, who's on stage with me, but then also the Department of War's incredible funding, XM Bank, the Development Finance Corporation, USTDA internationally, other pockets of money within the Department of Energy, like the Energy Dominance Finance Office, which was formerly known as the Loan Programs Office, and I'm sure I'm forgetting some, the Department of Commerce CHIPS funding. There's huge buckets available where we can get at this problem, and ultimately having strategic deployment of that low-cost financing, both domestically and internationally, so that we can compete with the anecdotal suitcases of money that Chinese entities are able to bring to these projects, I think is quite important. We also have the Defense Production Act Title III authorities that were recently invoked for energy supply chains, and that is a way that we can ensure that our industrial clusters that are emerging along the battery supply chain, for example, are able to access low-cost power at a competitive rate as we see Chinese entities do. And so making sure that, particularly as we have this energy abundance agenda, get more energy online, that it's not just going to this incredibly hungry data center energy demand, but also to the industrial production, mining, extraction, processing, and so that they can not lose out in terms of competitive PPAs. And then last thing I'll say is the anchoring of large downstream demand that China has is definitely something that we should be and are watching as a competitive advantage that we can have, not just with the United States, but you heard Vice President Vance at the February 4th ministerial that assembled 54 countries in the European Union, essentially saying, okay, together we have 2/3 of the world's GDP. We are importing an incredible amount of embedded materials. And so how do we use that to our advantage and say, hey, we're not going to necessarily continue on the status quo. We're relying on one entity that every single supply chain essentially triangulates via to be able to get these processed materials, because it is within the Chinese 5-year plans that they essentially take that material, control, influence, and start to build more and more of these downstream products, which will ultimately disadvantage our manufacturers, our automotive companies, our aerospace companies, our defense contractors from being able to compete, because they're just slowly taking this advantage and applying it across wide arrays of industry. And so I think that hopefully we'll see some movement there through the agreement on trade in critical minerals that USTR is now negotiating following that ministerial and the 232 invocation that delegated those authorities to USTR. But we're still at the front end of those negotiations, and being able to pool capital and work across capitals is always a hard thing to do. And so I wish those parts of the administration luck. We're trying to be as helpful as possible in providing them expertise, and then providing the support to that initiative when we visit Brussels, Canberra, Seoul, Tokyo, et cetera.
Great. Now, Abigail, when we first met was 2 years ago. We did a critical minerals conference, the Northern Miner Group did, here in Washington, D.C. And one of the reasons I was very excited to have you back is because you did an exceptional job really laying out what the challenges were regarding the gap between the West and China. It's been 2 years. We've seen more funding. We've seen more headlines. That's definitely for sure. But in this time, what tools have you seen that have been the most effective, that have really started to move the needle and maybe need to be doubled down on more? Or is there things that you thought should be done, haven't been done, maybe need to get done?
So this is a hard question because, as you guys all know, success in this industry is measured over decades. And so ultimately the interventions that we see today, it's hard to kind of say, okay, this is really going to work. We need a little bit of time to watch both the projects get into production, but also the market adjust. I think that maybe one area where we'll be watching most closely for success is just the incredible amount of tools that have been thrown at the rare earth supply chain problems. That supply chain has been tariffed. It has been, has guaranteed EBITDA for certain projects, guaranteed price, guaranteed offtake, incredible amounts of alternative and obscure ways of getting materials out of waste streams, alternative investments in terms of non-rare earth magnets. So really the US government has thrown everything at the rare earth supply chain problem. And so that is the one that I'll be watching in like 2 to 3 years to say, hey, did we succeed in this? I think looking retrospectively, the first investments that we saw leveraging Defense Production Act Title III authorities under the first Trump administration were for MP Materials, amongst a few other magnet manufacturers, including Novion, back in, probably around 2017, 2018. The investment that the Trump administration made the first go around in MP ultimately bore fruits under the last administration, where MP was able to start separating those materials. Now you have a doubling down where like that entire supply chain vertically integrated within the United States, short of the DY and TB that they're going to be importing probably from foreign sources, given their primary rare earth deposit is mostly lights, is going to be the test case for can we do this alone? But you also have investments happening internationally. I'm sure people have seen the Serra Verde acquisition in Brazil, those ionic clays that was purchased by USA Rare Earths, which has not only Department of Commerce and Department of War support, but also as of today, I was reading DOE support. And so you have really, I would say, not one-off investments in the rare earth space, but that kind of consideration of like all of our tools and what we can throw at the issue. So not really a good answer, but I will be watching that supply chain with most interest because some of the other supply chains, minerals, have less of that inclusive tool set that's being leveraged.
I don't think you can help but to give a good answer, Abigail, from what I know. That was great insight. Thank you for that. Madeleine, similar over to you, but framed slightly differently. I mean, you touched upon the need for processing, touched upon unlocking this innovative spirit, and you touched upon getting this momentum going. When you look across the supply chain, though, can you see certain segments of that where there is currently the most momentum? So I want to start with kind of the positive. What's kind of working from your perspective within the chain?
Absolutely. We are seeing so much attention on the midstream processing side, on the innovative technologies, on the scale up. There's been so much work in the space for years, as Abigail was saying, like, this is where there's been a lot of innovation there, and now we're working on de-risking some of that activity, some of the technologies, helping them pilot scale up, to get to a commercial size. And Abigail beat me to a little bit, but we recently just announced this morning, so breaking it a little bit here, $4.7 million for 19 projects that will fill critical minerals and materials supply chain gaps. The funding supports and develops the novel technologies that will be used in the production of critical minerals by developing pilot scale facilities for processing magnesium and rare earth elements. 2 projects have been selected for pilot scale processing from a continuous bench scale to kickstart pre-commercial and commercial production. USA Rare Earths, which you just mentioned in Stillwater, Oklahoma, is building a pilot scale facility to help pave the way for the operation of the nation's first mine-to-magnet supply chain. We hear about the magnets all the time, so we're very excited about this investment with USA Rare Earths. And then Big Blue Technologies in Cheyenne, Wyoming. This project will kick off plant expansion to restart commercial production of American magnesium, which is essential for advanced mobility and defense applications. And then there are 17 other projects as well that will develop innovative technologies and practices to diversify supply chains.
Excellent. Great news. Thank you for sharing that today. Very, very timely. And we had a company, Aftermath Silver, present a little bit earlier, which has amazing manganese, but down in South America, but a very important mineral that we're talking about more in this sector. So great to hear that. So that's the positive, that's the momentum, and a really concrete example of momentum. But there's always constraints. So I want to stay with you, Madeleine, on this one here. Where, from the West perspective, in terms of trying to really scale up here, where are some of the constraints proving hardest to solve? I mean, there's always going to be permitting issues. We don't have the cost of labor advantages that China has. But where would you say that's kind of a key factor that's a tough one we're kind of digging in on?
Yeah, I think permitting absolutely is a big part of the equation. And really just getting to that FID is where we're seeing a lot of companies are coming to us for support. So that's the bottleneck that we're seeing. And like I said earlier, de-risking some of those more innovative technologies and, scaling up these processes. I think we have such vast resources available here, but we just haven't been exploring them, haven't been processing them and doing the midstream and the downstream. So, and then also adding to the midstream and the downstream as well. What I'm hearing from the more upstream companies is that they just don't have the offtakes that are needed. There's no point in expanding if you don't know that you're going to be able to sell here at at market rates. So we are working on helping to de-risk, get companies over that hump so that they're able to get into the market and be profitable and be successful, hopefully without assistance in the future.
Okay, excellent. Thank you. Let's bring it over to Abigail. I mean, we do hear in the sector a lot this idea of the missing middle, that the midstream and the processing part has been a little bit lax in the West. Do you share that perspective? Is there enough projects in the works that if we ramped up processing and refining capacity, could we be at overcapacity? Like from where you sit, how is this shaping up?
So I'm not necessarily up at night worried about overcapacity in the midstream. I'll say I am worried a little bit more about oversupply for mined products, for extracted products, just because we already have that overcapacity in the market today that causes that price suppression, although we heard on the last panel how that's changing a little bit from government interventions here and internationally. I'm very concerned about kind of the lack of investability of the midstream. We hosted about 14 investors representing about $25 billion in potential capital with representatives from the interagency, including the Deputy Assistant Secretary a few weeks ago. And the first point that was made in that conversation was around midstream gaps and particularly having the ability to see where you can make returns. The Trafigura CEO has been on the record saying that we need to nationalize smelters because there's no reason for you to invest in this. This is, challenging not only in these kind of more obscure minerals for processing, but then also for copper smelters with the negative TCRCs, right? So it is very challenging. I think that is incumbent upon the government to see how if they continue on kind of the path of wanting to have the private capital flow, and we know money flows to the easiest path towards this problem, we need to see more interventions, both on the CapEx side, where these companies are able to essentially repay their CapEx investments, their loans, while also making sure that their OpEx remains competitive. A lot of that is going to be these direct government supports that we've seen. Maybe the best example domestically so far is the Korea Zinc US government joint venture for crucible metals in Tennessee that's supposed to produce, I think over a dozen minerals with the ability to absorb very different types of feedstock, primary sources, e-waste, lower grade materials into that, and then support not only the US market, but our allies' needs in this. But we also need to cut off the oversupply that we have today, the cheap material that's abundantly available. I cannot stress enough that it doesn't make sense for us, if we were to have this great successful midstream supporting this, you need to make sure that our downstream industry are buying this. There's been a massive change in terms of the procurement mindset for a lot of companies in the energy space, defense space, manufacturing space, following the April MOFCOM export controls on rare earths and magnets, where they really awoke to the fact that they have these supply chain vulnerabilities. And while the cost of these minerals may be a small part of the component of their ultimate, highly manufactured end product, ultimately missing that part is going to cost them a hell of a lot more in terms of worst case, or least worst case performance specs, but then worst case, you get your cars stuck in the lots essentially because they're missing the semiconductor, as we saw in like 2021, 2022. So overall, I think that we need to kind of supercharge the midstream attention, but anchor it around that demand, not only from us, but from our allies. We have so many gaps, so many holes in the ship that's sinking to plug at the same time. But ultimately, we got to get to shore. So
great. Thank you for that. Madeleine, let's bring it over to you. It's interesting, this massive shift in the industry zeitgeist now, whereas before 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago, government really wasn't on the radar. Now I sometimes personally wonder if we're tilting too much towards coming to the government too much, or expecting almost too much from the government. And we need the industry to step up more, and we need institutional investors to step up more. Capital can't just be coming from the government, obviously, right? These things impact all of us in the West. Are you seeing that message coming through? Let's turn it to the institutional investment, those large pools of capital that are sitting in America and to a lesser extent in Canada. Is that starting to back the critical mineral space in the way that's needed? And if not, is there anything that can be done there from the DOE's perspective? How do we get that message through to them? Because it looks like from us, it's still the mining metal sector is still very small in terms of portfolio percentages relative to other sectors.
Absolutely. We would love to see more. I think that's the short way of answering the question. We are involved, we're active, we are moving funding opportunities, moving grants and loans, moving, every authority that we have. That was our directive, to look at all the authorities that we have and how we can help solve this critical minerals, rare earth materials issue. And so we have been very focused on moving as quickly as we can and getting as much impact for taxpayer dollars as possible. But we would love to see more from the private sector. And we've gotten such great engagement. We have regular conversations with industry, with the interagency, comparing notes on who's talking to who. That there is so much activity, but we would love to see some more commitments there. I think that sometimes folks are kind of waiting to see what the government will do, and we are moving as quickly as we can, but we want the engagement. We want to see that investment, and we're moving as quickly as we can.
Great. So that ecosystem is being built out, it sounds like, more and more. That's it kind of starts there. And picks up on something that John Fennick said earlier about just getting those conversations going more and more between industry, investor, and the government. Abigail, put on your risk adjustment hat here for investors. I know you're not an investor. I don't want to be unfair here, but you are an expert at looking across these supply chains. Where do you see the most, in what segment of the supply chain do you see potentially the most positive risk-adjusted returns for our investors? Is there areas that maybe people aren't thinking about deploying capital that would be a shrewd move at this point?
So, it's hard to pick a node because the supply chains are so different for each of these minerals. I would say that definitely, if one of the things we hear from investors, which is interesting, is, and maybe interesting for you to hear, is we're afraid of backing a project that doesn't get U.S. government support, picking that loser essentially. And so monitoring and understanding the investment narrative so that you can ride the wave of where the U.S. government is trying to create this investment narrative, I think is really important. And obviously, I think that my reading of the administration's actions is really based around what's our worst exposures. The updated U.S. Geological Survey methodology actually ranked minerals based on what the effect to U.S. GDP would be if we were cut off from supply completely. And so it really exposed kind of the priorities that we need to have in terms of the adverse effects it could have on the U.S. economy. And then the investments have kind of followed in that suit. The other thing we hear from investors is that what they are most likely to invest in is, and this is more institutional capital, where they can hedge on the price or where there's the guaranteed offtake. Both of those things are extremely expensive for the government to, not to get too weedsy on our Office of Management budget scoring, but like for them to be able to score in terms of the effects of those projects on our deficit, the risk that the taxpayer is taking on. And so there are some applications of those types of policies in certain instances where we have no other choice to guarantee the project. But ultimately, I think that the market-wide approach that will ultimately shift, hopefully, investor thinking writ large is the efforts under the Agreement on Trade in Critical Minerals that I mentioned before that USTR is leading, where they're trying to lasso consuming countries together. Think about Korea, the European Union, Japan, Mexico, Canada, to be able to say, okay, we're going to create a market where we all agree that we're going to have harmonized regulations, and the things that we allow imported in, not just like the minerals, but the derivative products, will make sure that they're kind of playing on a level playing field of what a fair price is. And so that, I think, will hopefully create this investment narrative. Just to kind of the point of your question right now, Anthony, and the last question you have to ask the Deputy Assistant Secretary, I would really strongly emphasize that we don't need that much capital allocation in this space, but we need more than we currently have. When we started working with investors on this issue about 3 or 4 years ago, it would have been a dream to have the JP Morgan Supply Chain Resiliency Initiative come together. But we need that out of Goldman Sachs, out of Bank of America, out of BMO, and really ultimately a 1% capital allocation change in this space will not only help with our problems in the supply chain and the upstream, midstream, and downstream, but also guarantee their investments in the very sexy high-tech areas. Because if you don't have access to these things, you have a resiliency problem across the board, even for more secure kind of investments in traditional energy sources or in infrastructure. Obviously, all of those things need tungsten, nickel, manganese, magnesium, as the Deputy Assistant Secretary pointed out. And so I think that making sure that we're like hitting investors writ large, you guys all over the head with kind of that broader investment narrative and seeing that shift will make a big difference.
It's a critical point to make, absolutely. Another big issue of the day that I didn't want to miss the opportunity of having both of you here to jump into. Of course, our industry is so global, right? We have I look at many of the executives from Canada, many assets being held in South America, even if we just look at a Western corridor between Canada, the United States, Central and South America. There's been long traditions there of friendshoring, and we know we would define the supply chain resilience in those terms. But there is an increasing narrative about just domestic self-sufficiency and domestic resiliency. So I open this up to both of you, or either of you. Where are we going on that front? What is the realistic kind of goal and the end game here? Is it about stronger friendshoring amongst allies in broadening the sense of resiliency to that? Or is it really about America really getting its domestic supply chain in order, Canada really getting its supply chain in order? How's that playing out?
So personally, I think that we're not seeing as much domestic versus international tension. I think early on in the administration, rightfully, the first executive orders focused on what we could control, which was within our border, around permitting, around allocating investment, around coordinating all the different financing agencies. But after the April MOFCOM export restrictions that did not exclusively target the United States, it was a global-wide export restriction that cascaded across not only our industrial base, but that of our allies and partners. There was this reckoning of, hey, not only can we not do this alone because of what's limited in our subsoil. There are over a dozen minerals that the White House, USGS have been very clear that we can't economically exploit at home, but also our friends and allies are facing the same geopolitical competitor. It behooves us to band together. And so then you saw the February 4th ministerial, the request to engage in this agreement on trade in critical minerals, the rebranding of the Mineral Security Partnership into FORGE, and I can't even give you that acronym's name, but essentially a grouping of countries, around 22 countries from that previous body, to be able to engage internationally on mining and processing, and also Pax Silica, which is a semiconductor and AI-specific supply chain. If anything, there are too many international initiatives for you guys to all navigate, but it ultimately points to the direction of we can't do this alone. And the last Trump administration, when leaving office, wrote papers about the need to do this, and the Biden administration certainly was very much leaning on partners and allies. And so I think this will remain a staple until we have diversification done, and particularly until we have recycling ecosystems built out, because that's another way that you can have self-sufficiency, although I'll never kind of purport that self-sufficiency is the goal. It's diversification is the goal.
Okay, great. Would you largely agree, Madeleine?
Yeah, I think we can't ignore, where we are at present. We have to be realistic about what the supply chains are at this point in time, but we don't want to put off resiliency just for the sake of, well, it's working for now, so let's just keep going with this. So we're really keeping an eye on the future and really keeping that goal of domestic supply chains that are secure on our minds and where we're planning our funding, because ultimately many of our actions don't have an impact for years and years. So we want to ensure that we're keeping that in our sights in the end goal, but not ignoring the present.
Excellent. Okay, thank you for that. We are about at the end of our time, but I wanted to make sure that there was a minute or so. If anyone from the audience does have any questions, it is the big issues of the day. Does anyone have any questions right here in the front? Please go ahead.
Thank you very much for your time. I'm an investment broker in Washington, D.C., and it's very difficult to buy most of these companies that trade in Canada between the 5 cents to $3 range. Here in the United States, the SEC and FINRA, if you go under 5, you lose 40% of your marginability. If you go under 3, you lose all of your marginability. And if you trade under 1, you're all crooks. That's not a story. They aren't. So, like the old days, General Motors, Ford, they all traded in a 5, 6 times earnings. This business is between a nickel and $3, and it's very difficult to support those that we find trustworthy, believable, and can help this process. So the JP Morgans, and Goldman Sachs could buy Newmont Mining, all right, but they can't buy any of these stocks here. And if I'm going to buy Newmont Mining to manage your wealth, I buy Newmont Mining or Barrick. If I want to create wealth, I buy these institutions that are here because I can go, if I do it right, they do it right. I can go from $1 to $10, and that's how you'll create wealth. But nobody is after or works as hard to try to buy these smaller companies that aren't true companies, that are good, not penny stocks, not crooks in this industry. So the industry needs to, we need, as America, we need to understand this is their playground. 5 cents to $3. And once we understand that, then we won't think that everybody is a crook that's under $3. Sorry to use that kind of language.
No, absolutely.
That's the biggest concern. So I'll meet a bunch of these guys here, and I'll like them, and I can't buy them because they're under a certain order. I asked to come in unsolicited. So if I put in 6 orders and they're all unsolicited, everybody says, "Oh, these guys are all related." Number one, which they aren't. Number two is you can't build a position to help these guys to be successful, or gals, in moving that stock higher.
It's an important point to make. I don't know if there's a question there. I don't know if the DOE can't help you on that, but they're supporting some of these companies.
There's the frustration of these individuals that are dying for capital, and there's individuals like me that would make the decision to give them capital, but I can't give the capital. So the ones that are on the New York Stock Exchange, the American Stock Exchange, or the NASDAQ, which most of these guys aren't, I get five of the 40 people that are here that I can comfortably invest in. So it's not just me, it's just what's happened over the entirety of penny stocks.
I think it's great feedback. I mean, I did ask about what we need the institutionals coming on. Well, there's a good counterpoint why you're not, right?
You're right now behind the 8 ball. The United States is OLR, right? We want to throw money at good companies, right? Well, there's a lot of companies that are good companies here that will never see that kind of money because the regulations of FINRA and SEC. And be glad to help you try to figure that out. But most companies won't look at us. Most growers won't look at it because they get in trouble. There's some damn good companies in here that are going to be able to solve your problem and our problem and the world's problem. It's just, I can't help it. No matter how much money I ever can.
When we come back, we got to bring someone from the SEC so you can give them a piece of your mind. In the front.
It's a year.
So one mechanism that's worked in a number of countries that promote their mining industry actively is something in the mechanism like a flow-through financing, where you allow personal investors like this to take a tax advantage that allows them to participate in financing of these companies and these projects. It lessens the burden to government, and it allows the investment public to have an ownership in the industry that creates the social well-being for that industry within the country as well. So if one thing I've talked to our senator about from Nevada is looking at a mechanism like that that allows an additional source of funding that would bring these individuals into the space and widen the appeal to the investment community of the United States, top of mind.
It's been a huge part of the Canadian the scene in Australia as well. It's why some would say it's why we have such a thriving junior exploration sector, for sure. So, and it gets government out of the predicament of trying to pick winners, right? Because the government isn't predicting winners; it's just opening the playing field to get more.
It creates a wider ownership within the country of the industry in general. So one of the things we face in the United States right now is there's a big gap between the knowledge of what we need and where it comes from. So by allowing the investing community to invest in the industry, it gives them the ownership of not only the share capital of the company, but also the process and the well-being of the nation by creating these industries that are going to provide the critical minerals that we need.
Yeah, great point. And just one more at the back there, and then we'll have to wrap it up.
It's a bit of a selfish one. So first of all, I just want to commend the DOE and the administration for the funding opportunities that are happening right now. I mean, like 5 years ago, this would have been unimaginable. So it's great. I'm Line Company CEO. I had an application in for one of the NOFOs from mid-January. Can you give us an idea about what the timeline is for the turnaround to get a decision?
I don't know exactly which one you're talking about, but I can say that everything is as soon as possible.
On the flow through, I just want to maybe observe some of the Trump administration's thinking around the problem. And there was a lot of concern around the incentives within the Inflation Reduction Act and like shifting towards more having taxpayers have a benefit. And that's why you have these kind of proliferation of equity stakes in projects. I also think that they're thinking in kind of what they can do concretely in the next not 4 years of their mandate, but 2 years in the case of, in this November, a change in Congress. And so I think it's really challenging for them to kind of think about the exploration challenges and the ability to kind of invite capital into that space. I know one of the first conversations I had with this White House was about how do we kind of take the learnings from the flow through opportunities in Canada and Australia and apply it, but I think it just fell off the priority list. And so not to say that it ever should, it ever won't happen. And I encourage you to continue talking to your senators and members of Congress on that opportunity, because we do want the sector to, push capital into this space and not necessarily have the government doing this alone. I'm super supportive. There's obviously aspects of flow through shares. I'm Canadian originally that, we would probably want to contain a little bit more in the US market if we move with that direction. But I think it's ultimately a really, really good idea for us to consider how to do this in the next bite of the apple of a reconciliation package, for example.
Excellent. Okay. Please join me in thanking both Madeleine and Abigail.